Today we want to talk about geopolitical developments and the current condition of international financial markets. My guest is Gerald Celente, publisher of the Trends Journal and founder of the Trends Research Institute from Kingston, New York. Gerald, I'm very pleased and happy to welcome you again on my Wirtschaftsfacts program.
Well, thanks for having me, Roman.
Gerald, it's a little more than a year ago since we discussed the early stage of a dissolution of international financial markets. And what's interesting is the fact that back then we had already been discussing possible scenarios of how governments could turn this global financial mess into a war game. In the meantime, we have become witnesses of how the Washington government is destabilizing not only the Ukraine, but also Syria, parts of Northern Africa, and perhaps even parts of the Asian Pacific region. A gloomy forecast seems to have become reality. It's your turn.
Well, it's, again, as I've been saying for years, when all else fails, they take you to war. And this has been going on throughout history. And all that you pointed out is, in fact, accurate. I'm an American. You're calling me from colonial Kingston, New York. We're 2 hours north of New York City. This is the first capital of New York State. Right next to me is the most historic corner in the United States, the only place where there are pre-Revolutionary War buildings on each corner. And the 1777 Senate House is right around the other corner. I say that because the founding fathers of the United States, and this area where the seeds of democracy were sown, were all opposed to foreign entanglements. In George Washington's farewell address, no foreign entanglements. To Benjamin Franklin, to Thomas Jefferson, to Madison, to Adams, one after another, no foreign entanglements. And now America's become the foreign entanglement country. This country's falling apart. It's rotting. Our infrastructure is terrible. Anybody that flies into our airports from overseas knows what I'm talking about. You get on our subway system or train rail, it's mid-20th century at best. So the United States is now military-minded. Its pivot to Asia, its AFRICOM core now moving into Africa. As you point out, with Syria and Yemen, drone strikes going on virtually every few weeks. And then Ukraine. And all anybody has to do, Roman, is go on the internet, or of course read our Trends Journal, and you will see the true story of the Ukraine overthrow of the Yanukovych government. And of course, people have to take their time and get past the propaganda that's being spilled out in the Western press. But this was totally fomented by the United States and the European Union, Germany included. So now it's out of control. They overplayed their hand. They didn't think that Russia would automatically go into, Russia actually was in Crimea, I believe, since 1873, and they've had between 16 and 25,000 troops in Crimea, and of course their seaport. And the West had no idea that it would be annexed as quickly as it was. And that was their prize, and they lost it. And now there's the destabilization in eastern Ukraine. So what we're looking at here is this is a very volatile situation. And it could worsen. And at a time when there is no recovery in Europe or the United States. It's a cover-up. It's only being done by record low interest rates and flooding the equity markets with cheap money and having the hedge funds, private equity groups, and venture capitalists gamble. So this is not sustainable. And on a war footing, it becomes volatile.
Let's stay in the Ukraine. So this whole thing has already turned into such a mess, and as it seems, Paul Craig Roberts might be right by saying that the Washington neocons will be very upset by just watching the eastern parts of the Ukraine falling in the hands of Russia as well. So 1 or 2 weeks ago, the IMF warned the Kiev junta not to lose control over the East, since the agreed bailout could be endangered by such an outcome. So what followed shortly afterwards was a massive strike against various separatist towns in the East. So Washington seems to fight very hard not to see $5 billion going down the toilet, which had been invested in a regime change over the last years. Just think in terms of Victoria Nuland and her controversial statement, "Fuck the EU." So I think more escalation can be expected in this region, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's what I'm saying. It's out of control. You have a puppet, an illegitimate government in Kiev, and you have a that's totally ineffectual, and you have a civil war, as we had written, by the way. If you go back to our Winter Trends Journal, the cover was Ukraine, and we said it would devolve into a civil war. And it has. It is. The country is breaking up. And again, when you look at the GDP of Ukraine, I think it's like the size of Arkansas or Alabama in the States. It's not an economic powerhouse, but it's a madhouse. And it's also suffering economically long before this situation unfolded. It's been run by corrupt governments since the breakup of the former Soviet Union. So, but what the issue as I see it, it's no one's business. Let them, if they all want to kill each other, that's up to them. If they want to live in peace, that's up to them. Should not be the influence of the West or Russia. They should be left alone to do what they want if, in fact, they're a sovereign nation. And this whole attitude by the Western nations and other nations to dictate how other countries should be managed when they can't manage their own places, it is really something that has to be looked at seriously and stopped immediately.
When it's about geopolitics, I often recommend reading Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and its Geostrategic Imperatives from the early 90s. Didn't he lay out the geopolitical strategy of the United States very clearly after the end of the Cold War? It's like a textbook in terms of current events. Keep rising powers in Eurasia down. Would you agree? Of course.
Of course, yeah. And again, you can see what happened with the former Yugoslavia. And it just keeps continuing. Oh, by the way, something of interest. I don't know, Roman, if you're familiar with this, but Joseph Biden's son, Hunter Biden, of course, Biden, the Vice President of the United States, is now working for one of the largest energy companies in Ukraine. They supply 10% of the Ukrainian energy.
Yeah,
and he's on their board of directors.
Yes.
And not only him, but also our Secretary of State's stepson, Christopher Hines, his business partner, his name is Archer, he's also involved in this energy company. And when you mention Victoria Nuland, all anyone has to do is go on to YouTube and type in Victoria Nuland, December 13th, 2013, and there she is at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., telling all of the people in the audience that the future of Ukraine is with Europe, and for Ukraine to follow the path set forth by the International Monetary Fund, and the event is being sponsored by Chevron. Now, how's that for coincidence? And, of course, Chevron has just done a $10 billion fracking deal with Ukraine, and Shell also has done a deal in Poland and ostensibly with Ukraine for $11 billion. And, again, you bring in the vice president's son. This is not even news in the United States. It's not news. The State Department refuses to speak about it, and it's swept under the rug. So that's all this is about when you really get down to the bottom line. There are two issues. One is to continue to weaken Russia, so they have very little defensive capabilities, because if they're surrounded by NATO and the United States, they're locked in. And the second one, of course, it always comes down to the bottom line. Who's going to steal what from whom to make the most amount of money that they can? And that's what a lot of these wars are usually fought over anyway. And again, now we have the proof that the vice president's son is sitting on the board of the largest energy company one of the largest energy companies in the Ukraine.
German mass media, so they picked it up, perhaps a little bit different in comparison to the United States, but we closely monitor how the Russians are pushed more and more into the arms of China after the US and the European Union imposed sanctions on the Kremlin and part of its business environment. So a year ago, you told me, don't fight the Russians. You asked me, do you think that the US, their little Arab League, and the Europeans can win against Russia? Voila, now we seem to be on the cusp of such a scenario.
Well, yes, exactly what I said a year ago. Thank you for reminding me of that. Look, all you have to do is look at history. I mean, if Napoleon couldn't pull it off, if Hitler couldn't pull it off, do you think that Cameron or Hollande or Obama or Merkel are going to be able to pull it off? You don't fight the Russians. People should get this in their head. They'll eat sunflower seeds and die to the last person defending what they have. You don't poke the bear. And look, if anybody thinks that the United States or its coalition of the willing will be successful fighting Russia, look what's happened in Iraq. They couldn't even win there, and they've destroyed the country and killed over 1 million people. A wonderful time over there in Afghanistan. What have they accomplished other than the military-industrial complex getting rich off the death and destruction of a sovereign nation? So look at Libya, another one, fomented by Sarkozy and Cameron and Obama, and brought other European nations into it. And what have they done? Not only have they destroyed Libya, they've also created destabilization in Mali. You're seeing the problems now, of course, in Nigeria, which is again a corrupt country, but now they've armed their opposition from all of the weaponry that went into their hands following the overthrow of Gaddafi. And Gaddafi kept those people in line. So everything that the West touches when it comes to geopolitics is obvious by the facts it ends in destruction.
So Nigeria, I think you mentioned it, it's also one of the big oil producers, so there might be interest as well. But let's come to Europe. So GDP numbers are out for the first quarter and are, of course, unexpectedly weak, coming in at a meager 0.2%. So perhaps they might follow the US and start blaming the weather for such numbers. So one of this morning's headline is referring to IceCap Asset Management, who are saying the only thing booming in Europe is separatist movements, not the economy. Yeah. So I mean, isn't it interesting that even in the financial world, some players are starting to highlight such developments now? Whoever is not blind on both eyes can clearly see where all this might end, isn't it?
Yes, and as you well know, in a recent Trends Journal, the last two editions back, populist movements, and they call them separatist movements, or whatever they're by name. What am I saying is that when people lose everything and have nothing left to lose, they lose it. And people have lost everything. Small businesses, the suicide rates among them in Italy and other countries is astronomical. People have lost their homes and their livelihoods. In the meantime, because of all of this quantitative easing and other stimulus, whether it's in the ECB or the Federal Reserve or in China, they've made billionaires out of multimillionaires while everybody else is going broke. So now you're seeing these populist movements, and they're going to continue to spread. They'll continue to demonize, rightly or wrongly, a number of the leaders of these movements. That notwithstanding, it's not going to stop where it's moving to. And I can really see if with the right people running these operations, these movements, I could see a breakup of the euro in decades to come. I mean, it's a real possibility, and a fight for the restoration of nationalism rather than multinationalism. So, things go in cycles, and the multinational globalization cycle has peaked. And I believe that you're going to see more and more of the nationalism cycles where people want to retain and regain their identity. It doesn't mean you're an isolationist. It means that, you want to live your life and let your neighbor live their life. And I think that's going to be an increasing movement, not only in Europe, but around the world.
I completely agree. So it's not only about the euro, I think, but more and more it becomes a topic in Italy, as you mentioned. The whole country might fall apart.
It could well. Again, you have this, Renzi in there, and, he's just another one of a front for the multinationals. Nothing is really changing. And as you point out, I love the language that they always use. The numbers were weaker than expected. Weaker than expected by whom? Look, they don't even call what's going on in Spain or Greece with massive unemployment and Portugal. They don't even call it a depression. The major media still calls it a recession. It's a depression. And look what's going on. The only country that's doing relatively well is Germany, and because they still export product. And they're the Germans. They have scientific and technological minds, and they know how to use them well. But you look at the rest of the world, they can't compete with cheap imports coming throughout Asia. And you see the decline happening very strongly. What is the unemployment record in France? Or it must be around 12% or so?
Yeah.
In Italy? Yeah, so, and those are the official numbers. It's much worse than that. Oh, the other big lie, and I want to make this really clear, because this is one that really gets me angry, is this whole big lie of deflation. What world are they living in? Fuel prices, energy prices keep increasing. Food prices keep increasing. Taxes keep increasing. The cost of living at every level keeps increasing. And they have the gall to say we're in a deflationary cycle. Roman, the reason they're doing this is because they want to keep the cheap money pumping out cheap dough. And so what they're trying to convince the people is that there's no inflation, thus there is no risk by continuing to pump out cheap money and keep interest rates at all-time lows.
So, Gerald, the continent is awaiting the European elections. If you ask me, I have a very funny feeling in regard to a possible outcome of these elections. It is not very difficult to imagine the French Front National, the British UKIP, or the Italian Five Star Movement to turn out as strongest parties in the course of the European elections. Wouldn't such a development be very remarkable? At the end of the day, you might have a whole bunch of representatives sitting in the European Parliament who openly oppose the European Union.
Yeah, well, what are they looking at? The numbers are about as high as 25%.
I think UKIP even higher.
Yeah, even higher, huh? So if you had 25%, 30% in the European Union, in Brussels, of people opposed to being there, what a freak show it would really be. It would be, actually it's a freak show now, but now it would go live, because with the opposition there and the turmoil, it could really be a destabilizing factor. And as I said, this could be the beginning of a turnaround back towards sovereignty and more regionalism rather than globalization.
So here comes my last question, Gerald. I have recently read you want to launch an own Occupy movement in the US. Can you tell us a little bit more about your plans?
Yes, it's called OccupyPeace.us. And it's called .us because it's just for the United States. Any country could do their own. And the Occupy Peace, again, is built on the foundations of which America was founded. No foreign entanglements. Rebuild America. Close down all bases around the world. What are bases doing in Germany and in Italy and around the world? I mean, how long has World War II been over? I mean, this is 2014. The thing ended in 1945. What's going on over here? Take that money and rebuild your countries. Stay out of other people's affairs. You live your life, I'll live mine. If you threaten me, I'll defend myself. So I don't want a military force. I want a national defense force. So the Occupy Peace movement that we're pushing forward is one based upon no foreign entanglements, closing down bases overseas, and taking that money to rebuild America. And anybody wants to start them in their own country, you do as you wish. But that's the premise upon which we're moving forward on.
But to be successful in rebuilding the country, I think first of all you have to get rid of the neocons and all those warmongers.
With the Occupy Peace movement, one of our objectives is to use part of the direct democracy movement that they have in Switzerland, where the people vote, not the representatives telling them what to do. And so the Occupy Peace movement, the foundation of it would be for the American public to vote on the defense budget and what to do with defense. So they won't have the power. Nothing is going to change as long as the political corrupt groups are still running countries. So it has to go, I believe, back to the Swiss movement of direct democracy. And then people say, well, you'll have mob rule by letting the people rule. What do you think you have now? You have mobs ruling them now. They just have different names. They call them the Republicans or the Democrats. You could call them the Bloods or the Crips. I mean, they're murderers and thieves. So to me, direct democracy movement, one of the planks of it is also to bring back direct democracy and not have a small group of people dictate how you should live your life, what you should do with your money, and what they should do to you.
So, Gerald, unfortunately, our time is up. I want to say thank you for taking the time to make this interview. I'll be keeping my fingers crossed for all your projects, and especially in terms of such an Occupy movement, and hope to have you back here again in the future.
I'd love to be. Thank you so much, and thank you for the good wishes. All the best.
Thanks a lot, Gerald.
Okay, bye-bye.